Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch review, and today we're comparing two very important watches from the Rolex collection. The Rolex Submariner 114060 versus the Rolex Sea-Dweller Deepsea reference 116660. As with all my reviews, I like to start with the history of each watch. So let's start with the Submariner. The Submariner was released back in 1953 and was Rolex's answer to a dive watch. A few other competitors of Rolex were creating dive watches around that time, and Rolex really wanted to set out and create the best they could possibly do, and basically make the best dive watch available in the industry. And they had great success with the watch. Right from the start. The watch was first released in 1953, like I said, featured a 36mm case size and 100-meter water resistance, which was amazing then. It was a brilliant watch and featured no crown guard, so very different to the watch we see now. The watch later on featured a 200-meter water resistance edition for more professional divers or those that are seeking a higher level of water resistance. And now obviously we have 300 meters on the modern day versions. The Rolex Submariner, I don't need to say much about. It's probably one of the most important watches in the industry. It's definitely one of the most important watches that Rolex has ever created, and they're very reliant on the Submariner sales. It was incredibly popular right from the beginning, not just with divers. It was actually very popular with regular people as well. People would wear them to work, to wear them with a suit, wear them just every day, because they were fantastic, really well built sports watches. Because they were able to withstand such pressure down at deep depths, they were just really brilliant for everyday wear. And Rolex recognized this, that people were just buying them just to wear in general, and later on they released a date variation for those that just wanted to wear them to work. The Submariner has continued to be a massive success, one of the most important watches in the industry, and in the whole history of watches as well. It's one of the most iconic Rolexes there is. And the watch has sold for over list price for quite a while now. It's been an incredibly popular watch for a very long time. If you'd like to learn more about the history of the Rolex Submariner, then go check out my review of the reference 114060 that we're looking at here today. That'll give you much more in-depth review of the history and also the features of this watch, and also past models of the Rolex Submariner. This one that we're looking at here today, like I said, is the reference 114060. This was released in 2012, and this reference 114060 is the truest to the original 1953 Submariner in the modern day Rolex collection. Okay, moving on to the Sea-Dweller. We're going to kind of generalize this to all Sea-Dwellers, and then I'll later on come on to the Deepsea, which is what we're looking at here today. So the Sea-Dweller was released in the late 1960s, but it stemmed from the Submariner, which was released 14 years before that in 1953. So the Submariner was bought by obviously professional divers who it was intended for, or who Rolex intended it for, and also non-professionals as well. But the professional divers that really tested this to its extremes were the saturation divers, who are kind of the top tier of the professional divers in the diving industry. And these saturation divers basically spend a lot of time down at deep depths, so down on the seabed, but they don't rise back to the surface again or decompress at the end of each dive. They actually live down at the seabed in kind of these stationary submarine looking things. They're called saturation dive habitats, which are basically just big tanks that they can live in. There's obviously sleeping and food, toilets, etc., so they can full on live there for weeks or months. But usually it's just a week stint. So that's so that divers can do things on oil rigs, gas pipes, under the sea, quite intense dive work that requires a lot of coming back to the same spot again. So, and the reason why they invented saturation diving was basically because decompressing and compressing, so ascending and descending through those dives, was putting a lot of strain on divers' bodies. And they were very susceptible to decompression sickness and other symptoms of decompression sickness that were quite severe, can be potentially fatal as well. So it was an important development in the diving industry to be able to have divers safe down at those depths and to be able to stay there as well. But what happened when they were wearing their Submariners down at those deep dives and staying down in those saturation tanks was that when they returned and decompressed and returned back to the surface again, the crystal would pop off their watch, and they couldn't work out why. Obviously that's quite a big damage to the watch, and They obviously complained to Rolex, and Rolex kind of tried to work out why on earth this was happening. And eventually Rolex worked out that it was because inside the air mixture for those tanks or those chambers, inside the mixture was helium. And helium atoms are very, very tiny, so they're able to penetrate a watch. Even though it is a very watertight watch and very airtight, they were still able to get through the watch because they're so small. So Rolex set out to try and find a way that they could make sure that no helium atoms or any other atoms could get inside this watch, that it was completely airtight and watertight. And they found that too difficult. So what they did instead was find a way, or build a valve basically, so that the helium could escape during the decompression stage. So it was able to enter because they just couldn't help it from entering, but they wanted a way for it to escape safely without cracking any or damaging the watch. They needed to make sure obviously that that valve wouldn't let any water in or air in. So they came up with a patented technology, or a technology that they patented in 1967, which is a helium escape valve, which we can see on this Sea-Dweller just on the left-hand side of the watch towards 9 o'clock. And the Sea-Dweller itself was released in 1967 as well. And they came up with the name Sea-Dweller because this watch was designed for those that dwell in the sea, those that live in the sea and work in the sea, i.e. saturation divers. So this Sea-Dweller was focused at a very, very small audience of divers and professionals. Okay, so skip a few years on now to 2008, which was when this model was released, the 116660 that we're looking at. And that was the first release of the Deepsea. So Rolex took their Sea-Dweller, which was a massive upgrade from the Submariner in terms of depth rating and obviously the helium escape valve and other things on that watch. But they took that to another level and made it even better. So they made their professional watch even better and created the Deepsea. In doing so, they tripled or quadrupled the water resistance of that watch, which was absolutely massive and incredible because the Sea-Dweller at that time already had an amazing water resistance rating anyway. So for Rolex to be able to achieve that massive upgrade in water resistance, they had to make the case much larger. The older Sea-Dwellers were 40mm case size, and this new Deepsea version was a 44mm case size, so much larger. It's also considerably deeper as well. Featured a load of new different features on the watch to make sure that it could withstand that sort of pressure. Skip another few years on now to 2018, last year at Bezel. This model that we're looking at here was replaced by the 126660, which features now a slightly larger bracelet and a new movement. Okay, so that concludes the history on the Sea-Dweller Deepsea. If you'd like to learn more about this watch, its specific features and also its history and more in depth, then go check out my review of the Deepsea that I did last week. Okay, so now let's compare the features on both these watches. So let's start with the clasps. And the clasp, even though they're both glide lock clasps, are actually quite different to one another. The Rolex features a standard glide lock clasp, which is a brilliant clasp. It's fantastic for everyday use. The glide lock feature is a feature that Rolex put in the clasp that means that you can open up the bracelet and make it bigger or smaller by quite a considerable amount. And the reason they did that was so that divers could wear their watch every day, just when they wanted to wear it at home or with a suit at work, etc, etc. But then when they wanted to go diving, they were able to make the bracelet or the watch much larger and place it over the top of their wetsuit without having to take the watch apart and put extra links in. So it was an extremely useful feature for divers, but also Rolex, when designing this, were recognizing really that people wanted to wear this watch not just when they were diving. It was just a brilliant watch for them to be able to wear every day anyway. So Rolex took that amazing clasp, really useful clasp, to the next level on this Sea-Dweller Deepsea, and they changed it up a little bit. Still a glide lock, but it's slightly different variation. To work this glide lock, you unfold the fold over part at the top of the clasp, and then just behind that you lift up this central part of the clasp, which reveals the glide lock teeth, and that means that you can now pull open the bracelet and make it larger, or push it in to make it smaller. And all of this is happening while the watch is on your wrist. And the reason they did that is because they wanted to basically create the glide lock clasp and make it even safer to be able to adjust underwater while working, because sometimes you may want to move the watch to another part of your arm if you've got to fit another instrument there, and obviously your arm changes circumference as you move up or down. So they wanted to create a way that the diver wouldn't necessarily need to take it off in order to adjust this. And the reason why is because at very deep depths, In fact, most of the ocean is covered by sand, or like a silty kind of thing at the bottom of the bed. So if you took your watch off and accidentally dropped it while adjusting it, it would obviously be quite unfortunate, and you probably wouldn't be able to find it. So they wanted to find a way that it could stay on the diver's wrist and then reduce the potential of losing that watch underwater. Another feature on this clasp versus the Submariner is the fact it has a flip lock section to the bracelet, or clasp also. The flip lock section basically is 3 plates of steel, and they fold over one another, and you can unfold them by pulling them apart, and basically that extends the bracelet by quite a considerable amount, and it's so that you can really have a nice adjustment for, or finer adjustment for your wrist with the glide lock section. And then if you want your wetsuit or bigger wetsuits or dive suits, you can then unfold that section of the bracelet and make it much larger. So that just adds even more greater adjustability on this watch versus the normal Submariner. Overall, both clasps are brilliant. Of course, the Sea-Dweller Deepsea is a much more specific clasp, aimed at a much more specific user. It's also a little bit more cumbersome in the fact that I don't find the plates from, or the flip lock section of the bracelet very attractive, especially if you have it out. It's not particularly fluid with the rest of the design of the bracelet, and yeah, I'm not personally a fan of that, but it's a brilliant feature, and it's very, very useful for people who are using this watch for what it's intended for. Personally, I prefer the Submariner clasp, but they're both extremely useful. In fact, the feature to be able to adjust the glide lock section without having to take the watch off is actually a little bit more useful on the Deepsea, but overall I just prefer the smaller, lower profile version that we have on the Submariner. Next, moving on to the bracelets. The bracelets are very similar on these two watches. They both feature the Oyster bracelet, both in brushed finish. Very, very simple bracelet, brilliantly machined, very, very solid. It's built really as a utility or tool bracelet, and is perfect for both of these watches. You can't fault them. They look great. They're in like a matte, like satin finish as well, so they're not too shiny, which is good when you're using them as a tool. You don't really want something too blingy or shiny in your face while you're trying to work with this watch. Next, moving on to the case of both these watches, and we will start with the Submariner. If we go back to the case back, we have a steel case back, and then moving up onto the rest of the case, we have a standard steel case with polished sides and a brushed finish on the top. And then moving up onto the bezel, we have a unidirectional rotating bezel, so you can time your dives and set your decompression stops on your increments on your watch as well. The bezel is made from ceramic, or black ceramic, and it basically means that the watch won't tarnish over time, as in the color won't fade. You also won't scratch it that easy. It's very hard ceramic, so it means that compared to the old bezels that used to scratch very easily, you won't really have that issue with this one. It'll look much newer for much longer. Inside the bezel, we have little platinum inlays for the numbers and the index markers. And the reason why these bezels, same on the Sea-Dweller as well, are unidirectional is that you don't add time onto your dive by accident. If you knocked it, you can only minus time off. So that's just a safety feature that Rolex put on these watches, that you can't stay underwater and run out of air. Basically with this feature, if you were to knock it, it would basically mean that you would reduce your dive time, but you'd still have the same amount of air. Moving now onto the dial, we have a nice black dial with these kind of maxi markers, Mercedes hands, and a very clean looking dial. It's a really, really nice dial. It's one of my favorite Rolex dials. It's very iconic, classic looking. Yeah, can't really say too much about it. It's very, very simple. This one obviously is the 114060 reference, aka the no date, so it doesn't feature a date function, and it's much truer to the original design. Moving now on to the Sea-Dweller, and starting again with the case back. The case back on this watch is made from titanium, and that was in an attempt to try and make this watch a little bit lighter, because it's an extremely heavy watch, especially compared to a Submariner or a standard Sea-Dweller. The Deepsea is very thick and big at 44mm, so therefore a steel case back would only just add to the weight. So Rolex thought they'd add a titanium case back because it's a little bit lighter, but still very, very strong. Moving up now onto the case, we have a really deep case that's very thick, obviously to be able to take that sort of pressure down at almost 4,000 meters. So that's a really important difference between these two watches. Same finish as the Submariner. We've got polished sides and then brushed finish on the top. And on this one, that's slightly different to the Submariner, we have obviously our helium escape valve at 9 o'clock on the side of the case. Moving now up onto the bezel, we have a unidirectional bezel, same as on the Submariner, just slightly larger obviously to go with the rest of the bigger case. It's much more legible actually than the Submariner, purely because it is just much larger. This bezel features the ceramic bezel. Like I said, much better because it won't tarnish as easily as the older style bezels. It's much harder, so it won't scratch very easily and also won't fade over time. Also, same as the Submariner, we have platinum inlays as well with our numbers and increments, so you can time your decompression stops and obviously your whole dive as well. And then moving on from there, looking at the crystal, so the glass of this watch, this crystal is extremely thick at 5.5 mil. That's actually thicker than some dress watches, so that puts it in perspective. And the reason why is because this watch can withstand 3,900 meter dive depth or water resistance, so that's an incredible amount of pressure put on this watch down at those depths. So obviously a weak point of the watch being the crystal, this has to be extremely strong. The crystal is also slightly curved, which means that the surface area is slightly larger, which means that force is spread over a slightly larger area, but for the same sort of volume or underneath the surface area. If you think about an egg, or actually the bubbles that they go down in, down to their little dive chambers, the saturation divers, they usually travel in a sphere or something round, because actually rounded shapes are much stronger than the flat shapes. And obviously this features no cyclops, it's flat completely, and that just adds to the structural rigidity of this sapphire. Move down now onto the dial. Just above the dial we have a ring lock system that Rolex invented, and it's basically an alloy that they created with very, very strong metal. It's just a ring that goes on the outside or the inside of the watch, but goes around the outside of the dial, and adds much more structural rigidity to the watch. Makes sure that that watch won't collapse inwards under the pressure. It's slightly stronger than the rest of the watch, and basically when Rolex designed this watch, they put this ring inside the watch to make sure that they didn't have to make the watch even deeper and bigger to be able to withstand that sort of water pressure. So this ring inside there, that technology is pretty special, and made this watch a little bit smaller. Even though it is absolutely huge as it is, it would be even bigger without that ring. Moving now down to the dial, we have like a matte finish dial, slightly different to what we see on the Submariner. It's quite nice actually, I really like this dial on this one. We also have a date function on this watch. Maybe a good useful feature for a professional who's using this watch for professional use. Very simple dial in general though, obviously a couple more details on this versus the Submariner, but overall they are very, very similar. Okay, so that kind of concludes the features of each watch. Let's kind of compare now them side by side. So size-wise, there's a massive difference between the two of them. Not only is the Submariner much, much flatter and thinner, it's also way smaller, 4 mil in fact, but it does definitely look a lot smaller. When you have it on the wrist, that's probably when you'll notice the difference the most. Because of the depth of the Sea-Dweller Deepsea, it does wear much bigger really than a 44 mil watch generally does. You know, that's like thinner 44 mil watch. It's funny when you look at the two side by side, the Deepsea really makes the Submariner look very simple and kind of a bit basic, like a little toy. The Deepsea is definitely the granddaddy of dive watches from Rolex, bar the Deepsea Challenge. Obviously the difference in size is for a reason. The fact that the Deepsea can dive to 13 times the depth of the Submariner is absolutely incredible. The watch is not 13 times the size, so it's amazing that Rolex has been able to create such an amazing technology and patented technology as well, that they've created themselves. It's a real feat in engineering this watch. And it's a very, very special piece because of that. Even though that no one's going to dive down to 3,900 meters with this on their wrist, it is pretty incredible to think that that is possible with this watch. So which of the two would I own, or what would I recommend you to consider when you're thinking about these two watches? Obviously the Sea-Dweller, or the standard Sea-Dweller, is what sits in between these two watches, but now that we have the release of the newer variation that is 43 mil, these two have become actually more comparable than ever. So often we're finding people now just looking at going for the Deepsea rather than just the standard Sea-Dweller, because the size difference isn't actually that much. So what do I think about these two watches? Both incredible watches. The Submariner will be popular forever. It's a brilliant watch, and it's one of our most requested watch here at Bijou Diamond Jewellery. It's incredibly brilliant watch for everyday use. It's brilliantly built, it's very rugged, and they're meant to last a very, very, very long time. And they always do, and they're just fantastic everyday wearers. The movement is very rugged on them, yet they're just brilliant watches overall. The Sea-Dweller Deepsea, specifically this Deepsea that we're looking at, takes that to a new level of ruggedness. It's just an incredibly tough watch, and really you can just look at it and you can tell that straight away when you compare it to Submariner. But it is a very specific tool. No one will use it really nowadays for what it's intended for. The majority of people that buy the Deepsea just buy it because they love all the features on this watch, and an incredible feat that it is in terms of engineering, what Rolex have achieved with this watch. So that's what I'd say. If you're considering the Deepsea, it's probably not just because of the looks, it's really because you are really appreciating what Rolex has done with that watch. The Deepsea is not as popular, anywhere near as popular in fact as the Submariner. A lot more people go for the Submariner over the Deepsea. But for those who appreciate Rolex and what they've achieved in the diving industry, this is a very special watch, and the Submariner comes nowhere close to it in that respect. So who would I recommend each one to? If you're looking for a watch just for everyday wear, the Submariner is brilliant. You can't go wrong with it. It's much smaller, it's much more appropriate for everyday use, and especially a more versatile use as well. You can wear this comfortably with a suit or just a shirt and t-shirt. It's definitely a more versatile looking watch. The Deepsea, however, is much bigger and therefore much sportier looking, and I think you're much more limited with what you can wear this watch with. It really is much more of a casual watch, a sporty watch, whereas the Submariner, because of that thinner profile, can get away with slightly more formal looks. If you're after incredible technology, incredible innovation in terms of diving and technology to be able to take a watch to that sort of depth, the Deepsea has no competitor. It's an incredible watch, and you can't go wrong with it. If you appreciate what they've done there, then go for it, because it's an incredible piece. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know in the comments which of these two watches you prefer. Would you choose the Submariner or the Deepsea? We don't often get asked for the Deepsea, but it's a very interesting watch, and people are always blown away by it when they see it in real life, because it is truly an incredible piece and truly an incredible feat in engineering. As always, if you're interested in either of these watches, then don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description, and also at the end of this video, we'd be happy to call these watches into stock for you if we don't have them in stock already. And if you're interested in watches other than these two, some other watches in the Rolex collection or other brands in the Swiss watch industry, then don't hesitate to contact us. We'd be happy to call those into stock for you as well. Thanks guys for watching, and stay tuned for more watch reviews.